Imagine a time before time was counted, a universe where the sky did not yet hold the stars we know today, and the earth beneath was a wild, untamed expanse of raw power and terrifying beauty. This is not the story of the gods you worship, but the story of the titans who forged them in the fires of betrayal and cosmic fear. Close your eyes and let the darkness of the ancient void wrap around you, for we are going back to the very beginning, to the golden age that was anything but golden for those who lived in the shadow of the crooked one. Cronus, the king of the Titans, sat upon a throne made of obsidian and starlight, watching the cosmos spin with a paranoia that ate at his immortal soul. Have you ever wondered what it feels like to rule everything, yet trust nothing? To hold the power to crush mountains, but tremble at the whisper of a prophecy? This was the burden of Cronus. He had overthrown his own father, Uranus, the sky itself, to claim his dominion. But in his victory he received a curse, a dark promise whispered by the dying breath of the heavens, that he too would fall by the hand of his own child. Can you imagine the torment of knowing your legacy is your doom? That the very life you bring into the world is destined to be your executioner? It drove him to madness, a cold, calculating madness that turned the king of Titans into a prison for his own bloodline. One by one, as his queen, the sorrowful Rhea, brought their children into the light, Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, Poseidon, Cronus did not embrace them with a father's love. He looked into their eyes and saw only his own destruction. And so he did the unthinkable, not out of rage, but out of a desperate need to stop time itself. He bound them. He consumed their essence, trapping them within the vast, infinite cavern of his own divine being, keeping them frozen in a limbo where they could never grow, never challenge him, never fulfill the prophecy. Imagine the silence of that palace, the heavy, suffocating dread that hung over Mount Othrys, where the only sound was the pacing of a king who had swallowed his future to save his present. But power built on fear is a castle built on sand, and even the mightiest titan cannot hold back the tide of destiny forever. Rhea, the mother of gods, was not made of stone. She was the earth, the flow, the life that refuses to be stifled. She watched in silent agony as her children were taken from her one by one, her love turning into a sharp, diamond-hard resolve. She knew she had one chance left, one final spark of hope that could ignite the universe and burn down the tyranny of her husband. She was pregnant again with her sixth child. A storm was brewing in her womb, a storm named Zeus. Can you feel the tension in the air? The electricity of a secret that could shatter the world? Rhea fled into the deep night, guided by the whispers of her mother Gaia. She found sanctuary on the island of Crete, in a cave hidden from the all-seeing eyes of Cronus, the Dictaean Cave, a place where the earth breathed ancient magic. There, in the flickering torchlight, amidst the shadows of stalactites that looked like the teeth of a dragon, the future king of gods was born. But birth is noisy, and a crying babe could alert the Titan king, who sat on his high throne listening for any disturbance in the ether. So Rhea commanded the Curetes, the spirits of the wild, to dance around the cave, clashing their spears against their shields, shouting and stomping, creating a cacophony of war to drown out the cries of new life. Imagine the scene. The rhythmic pounding of bronze, the primal chants, the desperate mother cradling a child who radiated a light brighter than the sun, while the tyrant king sat miles away, hearing only the rumble of a distant storm, unaware that his doom had just drawn its first breath. But the deception was not complete. Cronus would come. He would demand the child, and Rhea needed a decoy, a trick so audacious it would become legend. She took a stone, a simple rough stone from the earth, and wrapped it in the finest swaddling clothes, pretending it was the newborn babe. Her heart pounded against her ribs like a war drum as she approached the throne of Cronus, presenting the bundle with trembling hands. Would he see through the veil? Would he sense the lack of a divine heartbeat? Cronus, blinded by his own arrogance and the overwhelming urge to secure his rule, did not hesitate. He did not look. He did not check. He took the bundle and, in one great motion, consigned the stone to the same fate as his children, believing he had once again cheated prophecy. Imagine the relief that washed over Rhea, the trembling knees, the silent scream of victory stifled in her throat. The king was satisfied. The threat was gone, or so he thought. But far away in the cradle of Crete, Zeus was growing. He was not just a god, he was a force of nature. Fed on the milk of the goat Amalthea and the honey of sacred bees, he grew strong, swift, and wise. He learned to harness the lightning, to speak to the eagles, to understand the deep currents of the world that his father had ignored. He was raised in the shadows, knowing that he was the light destined to break the darkness. He knew of his brothers and sisters trapped in the timeless prison of their father's essence, and a fire burned within him, a righteous fury that would eventually ignite the Titanomachy, the war of all wars. But for now, he was a whisper, a rumor, a ghost in the machine of the Titan's rule, waiting, biding his time. Imagine the patience of a storm waiting to break, the calm before the thunderclap that shakes the foundations of reality. The world groaned under the weight of the Titans, the elements themselves yearning for a change, for a release from the stagnation of Cronus's grip. The old order was decaying, rotting from the inside out, poisoned by the paranoia of its leader. And somewhere in the wild, untamed corners of the earth, a young god looked up at the stars and promised them that change was coming, that the silence would be broken, and that the reign of fear would end not with a whimper, but with a roar that would echo through eternity. Are you ready to witness the rise of the challenger? To see how a hidden son becomes the king of kings? The stage is set, the players are in position, and the first move is about to be made. But to strike at a titan, one needs more than just strength. One needs allies, one needs a plan, and one needs to unlock the secrets of the past to forge the weapons of the future. The war is coming, but first the liberation must begin. Can you imagine standing on the precipice of destiny, knowing that the next step you take will shatter the silence of the universe? This was the burden of Zeus as he descended from the cradle of his childhood, leaving behind the safety of the caves and the nurturing whispers of the nymphs. He was no longer a hidden boy, he was a challenger, a spark seeking to become a fire. But strength alone is a blunt instrument, and to topple a king who sits upon the throne of existence, one needs more than muscle. One needs a mind as sharp as a diamond. Enter Métis, the goddess of wisdom, the daughter of the ocean deep and unknowable. She was the first to see the potential in the young storm god, and she knew that to defeat Cronus, they could not simply storm the gates of Mount Othrys. For the Titans were vast and terrible, like mountains that could walk and crush the world beneath their feet. No, the victory had to begin with a trick, a subtle unraveling of the king's power from the inside out. Métis, with eyes that held the secrets of the tides, brewed a potion. It was not a poison meant to kill, for how do you kill that which is immortal? Instead, it was a mixture of mustard and wine, a darker alchemy designed to purge, to reject, to force the body to expel what it should never have consumed. Imagine the tension as Zeus, disguised not in armor of gold, but in the humble robes of a cupbearer, approached the dark fortress of his father. Mount Othrys was not a place of light. It was a citadel of heavy oppression, where the air tasted of iron and old blood, and the laughter of the Titans echoed like thunder rolling through a canyon. Can you feel the heart of the young god beating against his ribs? A drum of war hidden beneath a facade of servitude? He had to serve the very monster who had eaten his kin. He had to pour the wine and smile while his soul screamed for justice. Cronus sat there, vast and arrogant, blind to the doom standing at his elbow. He did not look at the servant. He only looked at his goblet, demanding it be filled. And so, with a hand that did not tremble, Zeus poured the mixture, the liquid shimmering with a deceptive sweetness, a trap waiting to be sprung. The moment Cronus lifted the cup, the world seemed to hold its breath. Even the stars, which were few and dim in those days, seemed to lean in, watching, waiting. Would he drink? Would he sense the betrayal in the dregs? But arrogance is the ultimate blinder, and Cronus swallowed the draught in one deep, greedy gulp, believing it to be the finest nectar. Imagine the silence that followed, a heartbeat of absolute stillness before the potion took hold. It started as a rumble deep within the earth, or so it seemed. But the rumble was coming from the king himself. His face turned the color of storm clouds. His eyes widened in a sudden realization of horror that he had been bested. Not by a sword, but by a drink. The nausea that overtook him was cosmic, a rejection of the unnatural act he had committed years ago. And then it happened. The first thing to be expelled was not a god, but a stone. The very stone Rhea had wrapped in swaddling clothes to deceive him. It crashed to the floor with the weight of a meteor, cracking the obsidian tiles. A symbol of the lie that had saved the universe. But what came next was the true miracle. Imagine the air shimmering as the essence of the divine was released from the prison of the Titan's stomach. Out they came, the children of Cronus, the brothers and sisters of Zeus. But they were no longer the helpless infants who had vanished into the dark. Time behaves differently inside a god, and they emerged as fully grown deities, their eyes blazing with the light of the unvanquished. Hestia, the warm hearth. Demeter, the harvest mother. Hera, the queen of dignity. Hades, the silent shadow. Poseidon, the shaker of the earth. They stood there, blinking in the sudden light, shaking off the slime of their captivity, looking at the young stranger who had freed them, and realizing, in a flash of instinct, that he was their brother, their savior. Can you feel the shift in the room? The sudden imbalance of power. Where once there was only one king, now there were 6 gods standing united, a phalanx of divine will. The Titans, who had been feasting in stupor, rose in confusion, their immense forms casting long shadows. But the element of surprise is a weapon that cuts deeper than bronze. Zeus and his siblings did not wait for the shock to wear off. They fled, escaping the citadel of Othries, vanishing into the wild world before Cronus could recover his strength. But this was not a retreat. It was a tactical migration. They needed a stronghold, a place to rally, a peak that could rival the dark mountain of the Titans. And so they chose Mount Olympus, the highest point where the earth touches the sky, a fortress made of clouds and granite, a place where the air was thin and clear. Imagine them standing there on the snowy peaks, looking back at the dark gathering storm over Othries. The line was drawn. The world was split in two. On one side, the old order, the raw, chaotic power of the Titans, who ruled through fear and dominance. On the other, the new gods, the Olympians, representing order, justice, and the civilization to come. But let us not deceive ourselves. The odds were still impossible. 6 gods against an army of Titans who had ruled since the dawn of time. Titans who controlled the pillars of the earth, the currents of the ocean, and the fire of the stars. Zeus looked at his siblings and saw the fire in their eyes. But he also saw the truth. They were outnumbered, they were outmatched, and if they were to win this war, they would need to do the unthinkable. They would need to descend into the deepest, darkest pit of the universe. They would need to go where even the gods fear to tread. They needed to unlock the gates of Tartarus. For within that abyss lay the forgotten prisoners of Uranus, the monsters that the Skyfather had cast aside, the Cyclopes, with their single eyes forged for craftsmanship, and the Centimanes, the 100-handed ones, whose fury was unmatched. Can you imagine the courage it takes to walk into hell to find your salvation? Zeus knew that to build the future, he had to embrace the nightmares of the past. And so, while the Titans regrouped, roaring their rage and preparing to crush the rebellion, the young king turned his gaze downward, to the cracks in the earth, to the places where the shadows are thick and heavy. The war had begun, but the first battle would not be fought on the battlefield. It would be fought in the negotiation for the ultimate weapons. The stage is expanding, the stakes are rising, and the universe is about to tremble as the alliances are forged in the dark. Are you ready to descend with them? To see what lies in the pit and to witness the forging of the lightning bolt itself? Because the war of the Titans is not just a clash of bodies, it is a clash of eras. And the thunder is just beginning to roll. Have you ever wondered what lies beneath the basement of the world, past the roots of the oldest mountains, and deeper than the deepest trenches of the sea? There is a place where light has never touched, a place where the silence is so heavy it feels like a physical weight pressing against your eardrums. And this is where Zeus had to go. Imagine standing at the edge of reality, looking down into a void that smells of ancient sulfur and forgotten despair. This was the journey to Tartarus, a prison so remote that they say if you dropped a bronze anvil from the earth, it would fall for 9 days and 9 nights before striking the bottom. Zeus, accompanied by his brothers Hades and Poseidon, stood at this precipice, not as conquerors, but as desperate gamblers betting everything on a rumor. Can you feel the cold sweat on their skin? These were gods, yes, but they were young gods, and they were about to trespass into the domain of nightmares. They descended not by walking, but by willing themselves into the shadow, slipping through the cracks of the earth like water seeping into stone. Down they went, past the caverns where the gems of the earth are born, past the rivers of fire that flow like veins of the planet, until they reached the gates of bronze. These were not gates made by hands. They were barriers of pure will, forged to keep the most terrifying entities in existence locked away from the light of day. But the gates were not unguarded. Waiting for them in the gloom was the jailer of the Titans, the monstrous camp. Imagine a creature that is the embodiment of fear itself, a being whose form shifts in the darkness, part dragon, part woman, with 1,000 vipers for hair and a tail that coiled like a river of muscle and scales. She was the watchdog of Cronus, placed there to ensure that his brothers, the Cyclopes and the Centaurs, never saw the sun again. The confrontation was not a battle of swords, but a battle of presence. Zeus, holding the flickering light of his own divine ambition, stepped forward. He did not attack with rage. He attacked with destiny. Can you imagine the tension in that moment? The silence of the abyss was broken by the hiss of the vipers and the low, guttural growl of the guardian. It was a standoff between the old terror and the new order. In the myths, they say he struck her down, but in the deep, dark history of the cosmos, it was perhaps something more profound. A blast of pure, concentrated will that shattered the shadows holding her together, dispersing the darkness with a light so bright it blinded the abyss itself. With the guardian gone, the path was clear, but the horror was not over. They had to find the prisoners. Imagine walking through a prison designed for immortals. There were no bars here, only chains made of cosmic gravity, binding figures of immense, incomprehensible power. First, they found the Cyclopes, Brontes, Steripes, and Argesh. These were not the clumsy giants of later stories. These were the master smiths of the universe, beings with a single eye that could see the fault lines in reality itself. They had been bound in darkness for eons, their brilliance stifled, their hands idle. Can you feel their sorrow? The frustration of an artist who is forbidden to create? When Zeus approached them, he did not speak as a king to a subject. He spoke as a liberator to an ally. He offered them nectar, the drink of the gods, which they had not tasted since the dawn of time. As the sweetness hit their tongues, the ancient fog cleared from their minds, and their single eyes wept tears of molten gold. They looked at Zeus and saw not just a nephew, but a purpose. Free us, they seemed to say, and we will give you the power to shake the heavens. And Zeus, with the strength of a storm waiting to break, shattered their chains. The sound of the breaking bonds echoed through Tartarus like a thunderclap, the first sound of freedom in 1 billion years. But they were not the only ones. Deeper still lay the Centaurs, the 100-handed ones. Imagine a being with 50 heads to plan a battle and 100 hands to execute it. A living whirlwind of combat. They were creatures of chaos, barely contained, vibrating with a raw, kinetic energy that made the air hum. Releasing them was dangerous. It was like uncaging a hurricane. But Zeus knew that to defeat the rigid, crushing order of Cronus, he needed a touch of chaos. He needed the storm. So he released them too. Now imagine the scene in that dark pit. 3 young gods, 3 Cyclopes, and 300-handed ones, standing amidst the broken shards of their captivity. It was here, in the heart of darkness, that the tide of the war turned. The Cyclopes, out of gratitude, decided to give the young gods a gift, a weapon that would define their rule forever. They did not have a forge, so they used the heat of the earth's core. They did not have hammers, so they used their immense fists. And they began to craft. Listen closely. Can you hear the rhythm? Clang, clang, clang. The sound of creation ringing in the void. For Hades, the silent brother, they forged a helmet. But this was no ordinary helm. It was the helm of darkness, forged from the shadows of Tartarus itself. When placed upon his head, Hades did not just become invisible. He ceased to exist in the eyes of the universe. He became a phantom, a rumor, the terror that you cannot see. For Poseidon, the volatile brother, they took the bronze of the gates and the force of the deep earthquakes and forged the trident. A three-pronged spear that could shatter rocks, summon storms, and shake the very pillars of the world. It hummed with a low frequency, a vibration that could be felt in the bones. And for Zeus, for the leader who had dared to descend into the dark, they reached into the sky above, pulling down the essence of fire and light, and combined it with the raw power of the earth. They forged the thunderbolt, not a simple spear of lightning, but the master bolt, a weapon of devastating focus. Imagine holding a star in your hand, condensed into a shaft of pure energy. It crackled and hissed, smelling of ozone and burning air, casting a stark, blue-white light that illuminated the deepest corners of hell. Zeus held it aloft, and for the first time Tartarus knew light. The shadows fled from him. He was no longer just a challenger. He was the lord of the sky, armed with the wrath of the heavens. Can you feel the shift in the balance of power? The prisoners were free, the weapons were forged, and the army of the rebellion was now complete. But they were still deep underground, miles beneath the surface where the Titans feasted in their ignorance. The journey back up would be the first march of the new order. Imagine the ground trembling as this company of gods and monsters began their ascent. The element of surprise was their greatest advantage. Cronus sat on his throne, secure in his paranoia, believing his enemies were few and weak. He did not know that the earth beneath his feet was about to open up. He did not know that his own brothers, the ones he had cast aside, were coming for him, armed with weapons he could not comprehend. The sleep of the Titans was about to be broken by a nightmare of their own making. As they climbed, the air grew cooler, the pressure lifted, and the smell of the upper world, the smell of pine and rain, began to drift down to meet them. It was the calm before the storm, the deep intake of breath before the scream. The Titanomachy, the Great War, had effectively started the moment the first chain was broken in the dark. The silence of the world was about to end, not with a whisper, but with a sound that had never been heard since the moment of creation. Imagine standing on the plains of Thessaly, the vast, green expanse that lay between the two great mountains, Othrys in the south and Olympus in the north. For centuries, the wind had blown through the grass without disturbance, and the clouds had drifted lazily over the peaks. But on this day, the air itself seemed to hold its breath, vibrating with a tension that made the animals flee into the deepest forests. The Olympians had returned from the dark. They stood upon the ridge of Mount Olympus, 6 figures silhouetted against the morning sun. But they were no longer the refugees who had fled in the night. They were changed. They were armed. Can you feel the static charge building in the atmosphere? It started as a low hum, a frequency that rattled the teeth of every living thing, a signal that the fundamental laws of reality were shifting. Zeus, standing at the forefront, raised his right hand. In it, he held the master bolt, the gift of the Cyclopes, a weapon that was not merely metal or fire, but a condensed shard of the sky's own fury. He did not throw it immediately. He let it crackle, let the blue-white light illuminate the faces of his brothers and sisters, let the smell of ozone and burnt air drift across the valley to the fortress of the Titans. It was a challenge, a beacon, a declaration of war written in lightning. And then he threw it. Imagine a tear in the fabric of the sky, a blinding flash that turned night into day and back again in a fraction of a second. The bolt struck the base of Mount Othrys, not to destroy it, but to wake it up. The impact was not just a physical blow, it was a psychological one. For the first time in his immortal life, Cronus felt fear, not the paranoia of a prophecy, but the visceral, immediate fear of a weapon he did not understand. The king of the Titans rose from his throne, his eyes wide, realizing that the stone he had swallowed was standing across the valley, holding the power to burn the world. The time for hiding was over. The Titanomachy had begun. But do not think this was a battle like the ones men fight, with organized lines and polite strategies. This was a collision of eras. Cronus called upon his brethren, the Titans who encompassed the raw, elemental forces of the universe. There was Hyperion, the pillar of the east, blazing with the light of 1,000 suns. Iapetus, the piercer, whose very presence felt like a spear through the soul. Zeus, the axis of the north, and Cronus, the ram of the south. They descended from Othrys like a landslide, their forms vast and shifting, their voices like the grinding of tectonic plates. Can you imagine the sound of two mountains crashing together? That was the sound of the first engagement. The earth shook, not just locally, but globally. The roots of the continents trembled, and the seas boiled as Poseidon struck the ground with his new trident. He was no longer just a god of the waters. He was the earth-shaker, and with every strike, he created chasms that swallowed the Titans' advanced troops, rewriting the geography of the world in real time. Hades, wearing the helm of darkness, moved through the battlefield like a ghost, a shadow that could not be touched or blocked, sowing confusion and dread among the ranks of the old gods. He was the unseen variable, the chill down the spine of the immortal enemy. But the Titans were not easily quelled. They were the architects of the cosmos, and they fought with the weight of gravity and the heat of stars. They ripped massive boulders from the earth, hurling them with such force that they ignited in the air, becoming meteors that rained down upon the slopes of Olympus. The sky turned a bruised purple, choked with dust and smoke, obscuring the sun for weeks at a time. And amidst this chaos, the Centimanes, the hundred-handed ones, unleashed their fury. Imagine a creature that is a living artillery battery, capable of throwing hundreds of rocks the size of houses in a single volley. They stood on the front lines, a blur of motion, creating a wall of stone that met the charge of the Titans head-on. It was a stalemate of catastrophic proportions. The war did not last for a day or a year. It stretched on. 10 years. 10 long years of constant, deafening conflict. Can you imagine a war that becomes the weather? For the creatures living on Earth, there was no sun, only the flashes of Zeus's bolts. There was no calm sea, only the roiling waves of Poseidon's rage. The world was in a state of constant flux, a purgatory of noise and fire. The Titans were strong, fueled by the stubbornness of the old order, refusing to yield an inch of their dominion. They were fighting for their existence, for the right to rule a universe they believed belonged to them. The Olympians were fighting for the future, for a world where order and justice could exist alongside power. It was an immovable object meeting an unstoppable force. Night after night, the sky would light up with the clash of divine weapons, painting the clouds in hues of violent violet and burning orange. Both sides were immortal. They could not die. They could only be broken, bound, or exhausted. And exhaustion was setting in. The sheer energy required to sustain such a conflict was draining the life force of the planet. The rivers ran dry, the forests were flattened, and the mountains themselves began to crumble under the stress. Zeus looked across the devastated landscape, his grip tightening on the thunderbolt. He realized that raw power was not enough. The Titans were too resilient, too deeply rooted in the fabric of reality. To win, to truly end this, he would need to escalate the conflict to a level that might destroy the very world he sought to rule. He had to make a choice: continue the stalemate and watch the earth wither into dust, or unleash a final, devastating assault that would risk everything. The hooks of destiny were sinking deeper. The prophecy that had driven Cronus to madness was now driving Zeus to the brink of catastrophe. He looked at his brothers, at the weary faces of the Cyclopes, and he knew the time for skirmishes was over. He needed a decisive blow. He needed to separate the king from his army. He needed to lure Cronus into a trap from which there was no escape. But how do you trap the master of time? How do you outwit a being who has ruled since the stars were young? The answer lay not in strength, but in the very arrogance that had caused the war in the first place. Zeus began to form a plan, a gambit that would require the ultimate distraction. He would use himself as bait. Imagine the audacity of stepping out onto the broken plains, alone, lowering your weapon, and inviting the most powerful being in the universe to single combat. It was a suicide mission or the greatest bluff in history. The winds of Thessaly howled, carrying the scent of ancient dust and new blood. The stalemate was breaking. The final act was approaching. And as the dust settled for a brief moment, the eyes of the world turned to the center of the battlefield, where the king of the gods and the king of the titans were about to meet, not as armies, but as father and son, for one last earth-shattering reckoning. Are you ready to witness the duel that defined the cosmos? The thunder is fading, the silence is returning, but it is the silence of a fuse burning down to the powder keg. The war is about to end, but the cost of victory might be higher than anyone dared to imagine. The moment had arrived, hanging in the air like a suspended drop of water before a storm. Imagine the scene on the plains of Thessaly, where the dust of a decade of war had settled into a fine, gray powder that coated the world in silence. Zeus stood alone, a solitary figure of light against the backdrop of a bruised and purple sky, waiting for the inevitable arrival of the king. And he did not have to wait long. From the dark slopes of Mount Othrys, Cronus descended. He did not walk as a man walks. He moved like a shifting shadow, like a glacier carving its way through the earth, carrying with him the heavy, suffocating weight of time itself. Can you feel the air growing colder as he approaches? It was not a cold of winter, but the cold of entropy, the chill of things ending, fading, and withering away. Cronus was the embodiment of the old order, vast and unknowable, his eyes holding the indifference of the stars. He looked at Zeus, his son, his challenger, and he did not see a god. He saw a mistake to be corrected, a ripple in the timeline to be smoothed out. The two stood facing each other in the center of the ruined world, separated by 100 yards of cracked earth, yet the distance felt infinite. This was the confrontation that the prophecy had whispered about for eons. The silence stretched, tight as a bowstring, until the very molecules of the air seemed to vibrate with anticipation. And then Cronus spoke. His voice was not a sound, but a pressure in the mind, a deep, resonant frequency that made the mountains groan. He spoke of the inevitability of his rule, of the folly of rebellion, trying to crush Zeus's will before a single blow was struck. But Zeus did not bend. He remembered the years of darkness, the siblings he had freed, and the world that was waiting to be born. He raised the master bolt, not in anger, but in judgment. The clash that followed was not of swords against shields. It was a collision of fundamental forces. Cronus unleashed a wave of darkness, a distortion of time that sought to age Zeus into dust in a heartbeat, to turn the young god into a memory. But Zeus stood firm, the master bolt glowing with a brilliance that burned away the shadows, acting as an anchor in the river of time. He hurled the lightning, not once, not twice, but in a continuous stream of blinding white fire, turning the battlefield into a furnace of light. The ground melted into glass beneath their feet. The sky screamed, but this was the trap. This was the lure. Zeus was keeping Cronus focused, drawing the Titan's entire attention, his entire reserve of power, to this single point in space and time. He needed Cronus to believe that this was a duel of strength, a one-on-one battle for the crown. And Cronus, blinded by his arrogance, took the bait. He pressed forward, his shadow growing larger, consuming the light, believing he had the upper hand. He did not look up. He did not look to the ridges of the mountains where the shadows were moving, not with the natural shift of the sun, but with a deliberate, monstrous purpose. This was the moment Zeus had been waiting for. With a sudden, sharp gesture, he signaled the ambush. From the high peaks of Olympus, where they had been waiting in the clouds, the Centimanes, Briareus, Cottus, and Gyges revealed themselves. Imagine the horror of the Titans as they looked up and saw not the sky, but a living avalanche. The 100-handed ones did not possess weapons of bronze or iron. They possessed the raw, kinetic fury of the earth. Each of them lifted 100 boulders, massive rocks the size of temples, torn from the bedrock of the mountains. In a single synchronized motion, 300 massive stones were launched into the air. Can you imagine the sound? It was not a roar. It was the sky falling, The sun was blotted out by a canopy of flying stone. The rocks rained down upon the Titan army with the force of a meteor shower, a relentless, rhythmic pounding that shattered the earth and the resolve of the old gods. Boom, boom, boom. The impacts were ceaseless. Before the Titans could recover from one strike, 10 more landed. They were buried under the weight of the earth they claimed to rule. Cronus, distracted by his duel with Zeus, looked up too late. He saw the shadow of the mountains coming down upon him, and for the first time, the king of time ran out of time. The bombardment broke the formation of the Titans, scattering them, confusing them, burying them in a prison of debris. It was overwhelming. It was absolute. The sheer volume of the attack turned the tide of the war in mere moments. The dust cloud that rose from the impact was so vast it wrapped the world in a twilight that lasted for days. But through the haze, the light of the master bolt still shone, a beacon of the new order. Zeus advanced, no longer the defender, but the victor. The Titans, battered, bruised, and buried, began to falter. Their connection to the earth was severed by the chaos. Their unity was broken by the shock. They were not dead, for they could not die, but they were defeated. The fire in their eyes dimmed. The oppressive weight of their presence began to lift, replaced by a strange, ringing silence. The war was effectively over, but the cleanup, the sentencing, and the binding were yet to come. Imagine standing amidst the rubble of history, watching the dust settle on the golden age, knowing that the world has changed forever. The air tasted different, crisper, lighter, free from the heavy stagnation of Cronus's rule. The Centaurs stood on the ridges, their many hands resting, their job done, looking like mountain ranges themselves against the horizon. Zeus lowered his bolt, the electricity fading from his skin, leaving him standing in the quiet aftermath of the greatest storm the universe had ever seen. The king was fallen. The new king stood tall. But what do you do with immortal enemies? You cannot kill them. You cannot banish them to the stars. You must put them somewhere where they can never harm the cosmos again. You must return them to the darkness from which they came. The journey is not over. The final act of justice remains. Are you ready to witness the closing of the gates? To see how the architects of the universe become its prisoners? The silence is deep, the night is long, and the final judgment is about to be delivered. The war was over, but the burden of victory is often heavier than the burden of battle. Imagine the silence that fell over the world, a silence so profound it felt like the earth was recovering from a long, feverish dream. The dust of the 10-year war began to settle, revealing a landscape that had been forever changed, scarred by lightning and reshaped by earthquakes. The Titans, those magnificent, terrifying architects of the cosmos, lay defeated, their golden light dimmed, their vast forms huddled in the ruins of their fortress. But what does one do with a fallen god? They cannot die. They are woven into the very fabric of reality. To destroy them would be to unravel the universe itself. And so Zeus, standing tall amidst the smoke, made the decision that would define the geography of the afterlife for eternity. They would return to the dark. They would go to the place where they had banished their own brothers. They would go to Tartarus. Imagine the solemn procession, a parade of fallen kings and queens, marched across the broken plains not with fanfare, but with the heavy, rhythmic clanking of unbreakable chains. The Centaurs, the hundred-handed ones who had turned the tide of the war, now took on a new role. They, who had once been the prisoners of the pit, would now become its jailers. Can you feel the crushing irony? The oppressed becoming the eternal wardens of their oppressors. They led the Titans down through the cracks in the earth, past the roots of the mountains, past the rivers of fire, down into the gloom that sits below the basement of the world. And there, amidst the swirling mists of the abyss, the great bronze gates were shut. Clang. The sound echoed through the universe, a final note of the old era ringing out. Poseidon sealed the doors with walls of bronze, and the Titans were left in the eternal twilight, trapped with their memories of a golden age that would never return. But back on the surface, a new problem was emerging. The world was empty of rulers. The throne of existence was vacant. Three brothers stood on the highest peak of Mount Olympus, looking out over the vast, unclaimed expanse of the cosmos. Zeus, the youngest and the leader of the rebellion, Poseidon, the shaker of the earth, and Hades, the silent watcher. They had fought together, bled together, and won together, but now came the most dangerous moment of all, the division of the spoils. Power, as you know, can turn allies into enemies faster than any weapon. How do you divide infinity? How do you share the sky, the sea, and the underworld without sparking another war that would destroy what little was left of the earth? They could have fought for it, they could have let their egos clash like thunderheads, but they chose a different path. They chose chance. They chose the lots. Imagine the tension on that snowy peak. The air was thin and cold. A helmet was placed on the ground, perhaps the very helm of darkness that had terrified the Titans. Into it, they cast 3 stones, or perhaps 3 shards of pottery, each marked with a symbol of a domain. The fate of the universe hung on a random draw. Can you imagine the stillness of their hearts? The wind stopped blowing. The eagles stopped circling. Zeus, Poseidon, Hades. Who would rule the light? Who would rule the depth? Who would rule the dead? Zeus drew first. His hand, still crackling with the residual energy of the master bolt, pulled out the lot for the sky. He would be the king of the gods, the lord of the heavens, the ruler of rain, law, and order. The clouds would be his floor, and the stars his ceiling. He breathed a sigh of relief, for his ambition had always reached for the heights. Next, Poseidon drew. He pulled the lot for the sea. A smile touched his lips, for his nature was like the ocean, volatile, powerful, and deep. He would rule the waves, the storms, and the vast, unknown trenches where light dares not go. His trident would command the monsters of the deep and the currents that guide the sailors. And then there was Hades, the eldest brother, the one who had known the darkness of Cronus's stomach the longest. He looked into the helmet and saw what was left. The underworld, the realm of the dead, the invisible kingdom. He did not rage, he did not shout. He simply nodded, accepting the burden of the shadow. He would be the wealthy one, the host of the many, the keeper of souls. He would rule the place where all mortals must eventually go, sitting on a throne of ebony, rich with the gems and gold hidden in the earth. It was decided. The cosmos was trisected. The sky to Zeus, the sea to Poseidon, the dark to Hades. But what of the earth? What of the sprawling forests, the mountains, and the fields where humanity would one day build their cities? It was agreed that the earth and Mount Olympus itself would be common ground, a neutral territory where all the gods could walk, influence, and interact. The balance was struck. The hierarchy was established. The Olympians took their places on the golden thrones of the mountain, drinking nectar and eating ambrosia, celebrating a peace that had been bought with the blood of the earth. The sun rose on a new day, the first day of the Olympian age. The birds sang, the rivers flowed clear, and for a moment, it seemed that the cycle of violence had finally been broken. But history, even divine history, is never a straight line of progress. It is a spiral, and in the deep, hidden places of the world, the earth herself was grieving. Gaia, the mother of all, the very ground the gods walked upon, had watched her children, the Titans, be cast into the pit. She had watched them be bound and humiliated. And a mother's grief is a powerful, dangerous thing. She was not done. She did not accept this new order of arrogant young gods who claimed dominion over her body. Deep in the caves of Cilicia, far from the eyes of Zeus, something was stirring. Something born of Gaia's rage and the darkness of the pit. A final challenge was growing, a creature so vast, so terrifying, that even the Titans would pale in comparison. The gods on Olympus feasted, believing the war was won, unaware that the final boss, the ultimate nightmare, was just opening its eyes. The peace is a fragile illusion, and the silence is about to be shattered one last time. Are you ready to meet the monster that made the gods flee in terror? The story has one chapter left, and it is the darkest one of all. The peace of Olympus was a beautiful lie, a fragile glass castle built on the rim of a volcano. For the earth remembers everything, And forgiveness is not a quality found in the bedrock of the world. Gaia, the primordial mother, the very soil that fed the roots of the mountains, seethed with a cold subterranean fury. She had seen her first children, the Titans, cast into the dark, and she would not let this new generation of usurpers rest upon their golden thrones without a reckoning. In the deepest, darkest cavern of the world, a place where the sun had never reached and the air was thick with the scent of ancient sulfur, she birthed her final child. His name was Typhon. Imagine a storm given flesh, a hurricane given a soul, a creature so vast that when he stood, his head brushed the stars and his wings blotted out the light of the sun. He was not merely a monster. He was the antithesis of order, a chaotic swirl of vipers, fire, and wind, designed to unravel the tapestry of the universe that Zeus had fought so hard to weave. Can you hear the sound of his approach? It was not footsteps. It was the roaring of 1,000 beasts. For myth says he spoke with a multitude of voices, the bellow of a bull, the roar of a lion, the yelp of a puppy, and the hiss of a serpent, a cacophony of nature gone wrong. He rose from the earth like a plume of volcanic smoke, and the very sight of him shattered the courage of the gods. Imagine the panic on Mount Olympus, the sudden, chilling realization that there is always something bigger, something darker. The gods, who had stood firm against the Titans, looked upon Typhon and knew fear. They fled. They transformed themselves into animals, birds, fish, cattle, and scattered to the winds, hiding in the sands of Egypt, hoping to escape the gaze of the ultimate predator. Only one remained. Zeus, the king of the sky, stood alone on the peak of the world. Perhaps it was pride, perhaps it was destiny, or perhaps he knew that if he ran, the universe would fall back into the primal chaos from which it had emerged. Can you feel the isolation of that moment? The silence of the empty thrones behind him, the roaring darkness approaching from the horizon? This was the final test, the trial that would determine if the Olympian age was a fleeting spark or an eternal flame. Zeus did not have an army. He did not have his brothers. He had only his will and the lightning. The battle that ensued was not fought on the earth, for the earth could not contain it. It was fought in the space between the ground and the sky. Typhon unleashed storms of fire and tornadoes of obsidian glass. He ripped up mountains and hurled them like pebbles. Zeus answered with the full, unbridled fury of the heavens. The master bolt, the weapon that had ended the Titan war, was now a constant beam of pure, white energy, a lighthouse standing against a tidal wave of shadow. The sky burned, the seas boiled, the fabric of reality stretched and groaned under the weight of their conflict. It was a clash of concepts, the wild, untamable anarchy of nature against the rigid, bright structure of civilization. For a moment, it seemed the shadow would win. Typhon wrapped his coils around the king, squeezing the breath from the sky, trying to snuff out the light. But Zeus found strength in the one thing Typhon lacked: purpose. He was not fighting for dominion, he was fighting for existence. With a roar that shook the foundations of the galaxy, Zeus summoned the last of his strength and struck Typhon with 100 bolts at once, a hammer blow of electricity that stunned the monster, searing his wings and breaking his focus. The chaotic storm faltered. The voices of the beasts fell silent. Seizing the moment, Zeus did not try to kill the unkillable. He did what he had done before. He lifted the entirety of Mount Etna, the massive volcano on the island of Sicily, and with a heave of divine power, he brought it down upon the monster. Imagine the sound of a mountain sealing a tomb. The earth shook one last time, and then there was stillness. Typhon was trapped, buried beneath the crushing weight of the rock. His fire turned into the lava that flows from the peak, his roars turning into the rumble of the volcano. The threat was ended. The chaos was caged. Slowly, tentatively, the other gods returned. They took their animal shapes off like shedding a coat and resumed their places on the thrones. But the air was different now. There was a humility in their eyes. They realized that their rule was not guaranteed, that order must be maintained with vigilance. The golden age of the Titans was gone, the chaotic interregnum was over, and the age of Olympus had truly begun. Zeus sat on his throne, not as a tyrant, but as a guardian, watching the smoke rise from Etna, a constant reminder of what lies beneath. And so, the cosmos settled into the rhythm we know today. The seasons began to turn in their order, the stars marched across the sky in their predictable paths, and humanity, small and fragile, began to build its own history in the shadow of these great myths. The war of the gods and titans is over. The echoes of the thunder have faded into the gentle hum of the universe, and the night has finally come to rest. Close your eyes and listen to the silence. It is not an empty silence. It is the sound of a world that has survived its own birth, a world that is balanced, steady, and safe. The monsters are in the pit, the kings are on the mountain, and you are here, drifting on the quiet river of time, carried away into the peaceful dark. Sleep now, for the story is done, and the history of the heavens is written in the stars that watch over you. The war was won and the cosmos was divided, but a kingdom without subjects is a lonely place, and the earth, for all its new peace, was a silent garden waiting for a gardener. Imagine looking down from the high, snowy ridges of Olympus, past the clouds that floor the home of the gods, to the green and brown tapestry of the world below. It was vast, it was beautiful, but it was empty, save for the animals that roamed the forests and the nymphs that whispered in the trees. The stage was set, the lighting was perfect, but there were no actors to perform the play of history. Enter Prometheus, a name that echoes through the corridors of time, a titan who had sided with Zeus, a thinker whose mind was a labyrinth of foresight and empathy. While the Olympians feasted on nectar and celebrated their victory, Prometheus walked the banks of the great rivers of Boeotia, his hands covered in the clay of the earth, his eyes scanning the mud for potential. Can you feel the damp, cool texture of the riverbank under your fingers? It was here, in the quiet solitude of the dawn, that he began the most dangerous experiment of all. He took the clay, the heavy, wet earth, and he began to shape it, molding it not into the form of a beast, but into the form of the gods themselves. He gave them legs to stand upright, eyes to look at the stars, and hands to grasp the future. But clay, no matter how beautifully shaped, is cold. It is heavy, listless, and without the spark that separates existing from living. Athena, the goddess of wisdom, breathed life into these figures, but it was a fragile, shivering life. Imagine the first humans, small and naked in the vastness of the primal world, huddling together in caves, terrified of the night, terrified of the beasts, terrified of the cold wind that blew from the north. They were alive, but they were not living. They were merely surviving in the dark. Prometheus watched them with a heart that broke for their suffering. He saw their potential, the cities they could build, the songs they could sing, the philosophies they could weave, but he knew they could do none of this while they were paralyzed by the cold. They needed a tool, a weapon, a protector. They needed the one thing that Zeus had forbidden them to have. They needed fire. But fire was not just a physical element in those days. It was the divine spark, the exclusive property of the gods, the power of creation and destruction that flickered in the hearth of Olympus. Zeus, the king, had decreed that humanity must remain in the dark, humble and dependent, for he feared that with fire, they would become too much like the gods, too proud, too dangerous. Can you imagine the tension of a titan standing between the will of the king and the need of the people? Prometheus made his choice. He chose the difficult path, the path of the thief, the path of the savior. He waited for the cover of night, when the moon was thin and the shadows of the mountain were long. He climbed the treacherous paths of Mount Olympus, not as a guest, but as a shadow, moving silently past the gates of the seasons, past the sleeping guards, until he reached the workshop of Hephaestus, the smith of the gods. There, burning in the forge, was the eternal fire. Prometheus did not take a torch. That would be too obvious. He took a simple stalk of fennel, a hollow plant, and he caught a single glowing coal, a tiny ember of the divine essence, and hid it inside the stalk. Imagine the journey back down, the heart pounding against the ribs, the terrifying precipice on one side and the wrath of Zeus on the other. He carried the future of the human race in a twig. When he reached the world below, he did not announce his gift with a trumpet blast. He went to the nearest cave, where the shivering humans huddled in the gloom, and he touched the ember to a pile of dry leaves. Watch the smoke curl. Watch the first orange lick of flame. Watch the way the shadows dance and retreat on the cave walls. For the first time, the night was pushed back. The humans stared in wonder, feeling the warmth on their skin, seeing the light in each other's eyes. In that moment, civilization was born. The fire allowed them to cook, to forge, to see, to dream. But secrets in the ancient world do not stay secret for long. From his high throne, Zeus looked down at the darkened earth and saw something that should not be there. He saw thousands of tiny, flickering stars on the ground, mirroring the stars in the sky. He saw the smoke of hearths. He saw the light of progress. And his rage was colder than the winter wind. He knew who had done this. He knew the thief. The punishment he devised was not a simple execution, for titans cannot die. It was a sentence of eternal stillness. Prometheus was taken to the ends of the earth, to the desolate, wind-swept peaks of the Caucasus Mountains. There, he was bound to a rock with chains of adamantine, unbreakable and unforgiving. Imagine the silence of that high place, where the only sound is the wind howling through the crags and the distant beat of wings. He was left there, exposed to the elements, the sun scorching him by day, the frost biting him by night, a living monument to the price of progress. He stood there, suspended between the earth he loved and the sky he had betrayed, a silent guardian who paid for your warmth with his freedom. But even in his chains, Prometheus did not regret. He looked down from his mountain prison and saw the fires burning in the villages. He saw the smoke rising from the altars, and he knew that the spark could never be put out. The genie was out of the bottle. Humanity had the fire, and with it, they had the power to challenge the dark, to challenge the cold, and eventually to challenge the gods themselves. The story of the war was over, but the story of the struggle had just begun. Are you ready to see what happens when the gods decide to send a gift of their own? A gift wrapped in beauty but hiding a trap that would change the world forever? The fire is burning, the shadows are dancing, and the first box is about to be opened. The fire was burning in the hearths of men, a stolen gift that had changed the cold nights into warm gatherings. But every gift has a price, and the invoice from Olympus was about to be delivered. Zeus sat on his high throne, watching the smoke rise from the human villages, and his anger had cooled into something far more dangerous, a cold, calculating malice. He knew he could not take the fire back, for once a secret is known, it cannot be unlearned, so he decided to send a gift of his own, a counterweight to the blessing of Prometheus. Imagine the forge of Hephaestus, the lame smith god, glowing not with the orange heat of battle, but with the subtle violet light of creation. He was not making a sword or a shield. He was molding the earth again, but this time he was crafting a masterpiece of deception. He created a woman. Her skin was made of the finest white marble turned to flesh. Her eyes were polished sapphires that held the depth of the sea, and her voice was the sound of the wind moving through the reeds. She was perfection, a trap designed to be irresistible. But Hephaestus only made the shell. The other gods were called upon to fill it. Aphrodite gave her grace and desire, the kind that clouds the mind of rational men. Athena gave her the skills of weaving and the intricate arts. Hermes, the trickster, gave her a curious mind and a tongue capable of sweet lies. They named her Pandora, which means all-gifted, because she was the sum of their divine brilliance. But Zeus gave her the final gift, a wedding present that she was told never to use. It was a jar, a pithos, made of heavy ceramic, sealed with a lid of beeswax and lead, painted with figures that seemed to move when you looked at them out of the corner of your eye. It was beautiful, it was heavy, and it was dangerous. Can you feel the weight of it in your hands? The instructions were simple. Enjoy your life, but never, under any circumstances, open the jar. Now, the trap needed a target. Prometheus, the foresight, was bound to his rock, beyond reach. But he had a brother, Epimetheus, whose name means hindsight. Epimetheus was a gentle soul, a dreamer who only understood the consequences of his actions after they had happened. Prometheus had warned him, never take a gift from Zeus, send it back. But when Hermes arrived at his door, guiding the most beautiful creature the world had ever seen, holding a mysterious jar that hummed with a strange energy. Prometheus forgot the warning. He looked into Pandora's eyes and saw only light. He did not see the shadow standing behind her. They were married in the first spring of the world, and for a time life was a paradise. The earth was still bountiful, sickness was unknown, and old age was just a rumor. But the jar sat in the corner of their home, a silent observer. Imagine the psychological torture of a forbidden door. Every day, Pandora walked past it. Every day, the light caught the glazed surface. Every day, the question grew louder in her mind. Why give a gift that cannot be enjoyed? What is so precious that the King of Gods wants it kept in the dark? Curiosity is not a sin. It is the engine of the universe, the same force that led humanity to the fire. It was inevitable. One quiet afternoon, when the shadows were long and the house was still, Pandora knelt before the jar. Her heart beat against her ribs like a trapped bird. She traced the seal with her finger. She did not want to destroy. She only wanted to know. Just a peek, she told herself. Just a glimpse of the treasure inside. She dug her fingernails into the wax. She broke the seal. She lifted the heavy lid just an inch. And in that moment, the golden age ended. It was not a treasure that flew out. It was a swarm. Imagine a cloud of dark, invisible moths, a rush of cold air that smelled of stagnant water and old dust. These were not monsters with teeth and claws. They were the spites. Sickness, old age, jealousy, greed, toil, and sorrow. They rushed out of the jar in a torrent of shadows, filling the room, filling the house, filling the world. Pandora, terrified, slammed the lid back down, using all her strength to seal the breach. The heavy ceramic thudded shut, cutting off the stream. The room was quiet again, but it was different. The air was heavier. The light was dimmer. The spites had escaped, and they had already begun their work. Outside, the wind howled with a new, biting cold, and for the first time, Prometheus felt a pain in his joints, the ache of mortality. But the jar was not empty. Trapped inside, caught under the lip of the jar when Pandora slammed it shut, was one final spirit. It was not a spite. It was a small, fragile thing, glowing with a pale, persistent light. It was Elpis, hope. Zeus, in his cruel wisdom, had packed the only antidote to the poison along with the poison itself, but he had ensured it would remain trapped. Or perhaps this was the mercy, because the evils were now out in the world, tearing at the fabric of human happiness. Humanity would need something to keep them from giving up, something to keep them moving forward when the night was darkest. Hope remained in the jar, kept safe for the moments when it was needed most. Imagine the world changing in an instant. The eternal spring turned into the cycle of seasons. The easy harvest turned into hard labor. The laughter turned into worry. But in every human heart, there remains that memory of the jar, and the knowledge that while the world is full of sorrow, there is something else, something hidden, something that refuses to leave. The trap was sprung, the innocence was lost, and humanity was cast out of the garden of ignorance. But the story does not end in despair. It ends with a question. How do humans survive in a world filled with the anger of the gods? They survive because of the next great chapter, the Age of Heroes, the age where men and women take the fire and the hope and forge their own destiny. Are you ready to see how the blood of the gods mixes with the clay of the earth to create the legends that will challenge the heavens themselves? The jar is closed, but the world is wide open, and the first hero is about to be born. The jar was closed, but the silence of the golden age was gone forever, replaced by the noise of a world in constant motion. Imagine standing on a cliff edge, looking out over a sea that is no longer calm, but churned by the winds of change. The spites that Pandora released, the toil, the sickness, the envy, had settled into the soil like a heavy frost, turning the paradise of the early days into the Iron Age, the age of struggle. But remember, the gods are architects of balance, and for every shadow that walks the earth, a light must be kindled to meet it. Zeus, sitting on his throne, looked down at the struggling mortals, shivering in their winters and battling their demons, and he realized that humanity needed more than just fire. they needed champions. They needed a bridge between the dust of the earth and the ichor of the heavens. And so, the Age of Heroes began. It did not start with a thunderclap, but with a whisper, a meeting of the divine and the mortal in the quiet groves and the moonlit palaces of the world. The blood of the Olympians began to mix with the blood of men, creating a new kind of being, the demigod. Imagine a figure walking out of the mist, looking like a man but moving with the grace of a panther and the strength of a mountain. These were the children of the new era: Perseus, Heracles, Theseus, Jason. They were not born into a world of peace. They were born into a world of monsters. For Gaia, the Earth Mother, was still dreaming, and her dreams took the form of trials. The Nemean lion with its impenetrable skin, the Hydra with its regenerating heads, the Minotaur in the dark labyrinth of Crete. These were not just beasts. They were the physical manifestations of the chaos that still lurked at the edges of civilization. And the heroes were the answer. Can you feel the weight of the shield on your arm? Can you feel the grip of the sword hilt? This was the destiny of the Iron Age. To fight the darkness not with magic, but with courage. To sail the uncharted seas on the Argo, chasing a golden fleece that promised kingship. To walk into the cave of the Gorgon, using only a reflection to guide your strike. To hold up the sky itself, if only for a moment, to relieve the Titan Atlas of his burden. The story of the universe shifted from the cosmic wars of giant entities to the personal, intimate struggles of the human heart. It became a story of resilience. It became a story of hope, that small, glowing spirit from the bottom of the jar, fueling the will to endure against impossible odds. And as the heroes lived and fought, they began to change the geography of the heavens. Look up. Look at the night sky. Do you see them? The stars are no longer just random points of light. They are pictures, memories, monuments. There is the constellation of Hercules, kneeling in the dark. There is Pegasus, the winged horse, soaring through the Milky Way. There is Andromeda, the princess, and Draco, the dragon. The history of the war, the history of the Titans, and the history of the heroes were written in the constellations so that humanity would never forget. The chaos was organized. The darkness was mapped. The universe had finally found its shape. And what of the old gods? What of Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades? They retreated slowly, pulling back behind the veil of the clouds, becoming less of a physical presence and more of a feeling. You hear Zeus in the roll of the thunder, but you do not see him. You feel Poseidon in the salt spray of the ocean, but his chariot is hidden beneath the waves. You sense Hades in the quiet stillness of a graveyard, invisible and silent. They stepped back to let humanity take the stage, to let the fire of Prometheus burn on its own. The cycle is complete. We traveled from the dark, swirling void of chaos, through the brutal reign of Uranus, the golden tyranny of Cronus, and the thunderous liberation of Zeus. We saw the Titanomachy shake the foundations of reality, we saw the division of the three kingdoms, and we saw the birth of the first men and women. It has been a long journey, a journey of billions of years condensed into a single story. And now the story is done. The wars are over. The monsters are stone. The heroes are stars. The world you live in now, the quiet, breathing world outside your window, is the result of that ancient struggle. It is balanced. It is steady. The gravity that holds you to your bed is the same gravity that chained the Titans. The air you breathe is the same air that filled the lungs of Heracles. You are part of this tapestry woven into the very end of the thread. Imagine the library of the universe closing its great, heavy doors. The book is placed back on the shelf. The dust settles in the beams of moonlight. There is nothing left to fear, nothing left to fight, nothing left to solve. The answers have all been given. The silence that surrounds you now is not the terrifying silence of the void, but the peaceful, protective silence of a finished tale. It is time to let go of the myths, to let go of the history, and to drift into your own personal dream time. The gods are watching over you, silent sentinels in the night. The earth is holding you warm and safe. The fire is in the hearth, and the hope is in your heart. Close your eyes. Let the weight of your own eyelids be the heaviest thing in the world. Drift down, past the clouds, past the mountains, past the rivers, into the deep, soft, velvet dark. Sleep now. Sleep. The story is over. Good night.